Well, good evening. Welcome to the second Scottish Family Party live stream. I'll introduce our special guest for the evening in a minute, but just to announce a few things coming up on the live stream as well. Next Wednesday, we've got a sort of phone-in chat with Phil Tanzer, who's a very interesting character with an interesting story. So if you want to chip in and have a word with him next week, that'll be that. The week after that, we've got Katie Forst, who's from an organization in America called Them Before Us. And the emphasis of that organization is the effect of fatherlessness on children, fatherlessness through whatever cause, deliberate or as a result of divorce or whatever. So she'll be sharing her thoughts with us. It won't be me interviewing her. It will be our patron, Belinda Brown. So not to mention, before we kick off as well, our conference is coming up, our online conference, 14th of November. We do get your tickets. It's free for members. Just £5 for non-members, and it's pinned to the top of our Facebook page, and it's on our YouTube channel as well in the community thread there. Now, our special guest this week, I will bring on to the screen. So welcome to Chris McGovern. Chris is the chairman of the Campaign for Real Education. Great to have you with us. I can't hear anything now.
Can't hear anything yet.
Oh, that's it. You're in. Yep.
Okay. Well, look, thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here.
Pleasure. Now, the Campaign for Real Education is a group I've been aware of for quite a while, and I have to confess, when it came to writing the Scottish Family Party's education policy, one of the places we looked at for a bit of inspiration was the Campaign for Real Education, because a lot of great thinking there, and very much on the wavelength of the Scottish Family Party. So, Chris, you want to start off just telling us a little bit about your background in education?
Yeah, well, I'm retired now. I was a teacher for 35 years. Taught the first half of my career in the state sector, large state comprehensives, in North Yorkshire, in Devon, and in Sussex. And then I had a big falling out back in the late 80s, actually, because I said that the Scottish examination system in those days was actually better than what was going to come into England. We had a new exam coming into England called GCSE. I said, look, the Scots are keeping with the O grade. That's actually better. So I double entered my kids, my youngsters, for O grade as well as the GCSE, and taught them privately, free of charge, of course, off the site. I was accused of insubordination and mutiny by my governing body, and many felt it warranted sackings. Anyway, it ended up being discussed in Parliament in the House of Lords. You can read it in Hansard. It became a big story, particularly in Scotland, because I saying, look, the Scottish system is better. They're at least being sensible, keeping with the O grade. I had to move out. I had to get a job in the independent sector. Was very successful, became head teacher eventually in North London. And it was a Catholic school, actually, at the end, and it was very popular. It was 9 applicants for each place, and I suppose you could say, it was well run, and I was very happy there. But I moved from secondary to primary, so I've sort of got experience of teaching, 5-year-olds and 18-year-olds, boys and girls, the most able and the least able. And I suppose that, and I've also, during all that time, advised two prime ministers at Downing Street. I've advised Michael Gove quite recently on history, mainly in the national curriculum. Though when he meets me these days, he just glares at me because I talk to people like you, and I still stir it up a little bit. So, but yeah, we've had a very, very high profile. We've had lots of coverage, both in Britain and around the world. And we are, I think, I would say the Campaign for Education, which was set up back in the 80s, was set up really to defend traditional education, to defend parents, certainly, but also to stand up for what education is really about, which is about knowledge and about learning, And we want children to leave school being able to read and write and get a job, rather than being sort of indoctrinated, in social theory. And that's very old-fashioned, it seems, but not old-fashioned in places like Singapore, which are several years ahead of Scotland and England, for that matter, or 3 years ahead by the age of 15. So we're traditional, but we're not traditional in Singapore or Shanghai or in Taiwan or Japan. Yeah.
So the Campaign for Real Education, do you feel it's an uphill struggle, or do you feel the tide's turning, or what's the state of play, do you think?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm a historian, so what it reminds me of a little bit is those Japanese soldiers who carried on fighting the Second World War decades after it was over. we're stuck on those Pacific islands. We don't realise the war's over and we're still fighting on against all the odds. Are we winning? We've won some debates. I think, a lot of parents support us, and in the media, I think we have a very sympathetic healing in the media. So a lot of people come to us because we give a different point of view. So are we winning? No, we've lost the battle completely. And you've only got to look around the schools in Britain, whether it's in England or Wales or Northern Ireland or in Scotland. Look, you can see it. Look about you. What was it said of Christopher Wren? If you want to see my monument, look around you. You want to see the monument to education in the United Kingdom, just look around you. Look at the state it's in. We are about 3 years behind the best education systems in the world, and we're not getting any better. Scotland in the latest, what they call the PISA test, the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, these important tests every 3 years. I mean, Scotland's at a record low now in maths and in science. Slightly, a little bit.
We've solved the problem now, though. We've solved the problem by withdrawing from the tests.
That's a very good way to do it. This is the curriculum for failure, and therefore that you've got here in Scotland, and therefore by withdrawing from the tests, of course, you can cover it up. And what's interesting? I was looking today at one of these fact check programs, which confirm what I just said. Scotland's got a record low in numeracy and in science, but you've got a very high scores in your exams. You never had your own exams. Scotland, I say yours, it's mine too. Also, my father's from Ulster, so I've got a sort of connection to feel with Scotland. And look, it's crazy where the exam system is showing that Scotland has never done better, but reality, which is what we're getting on the international test, showing Scotland's never done worse. Who suffers from this? The young people whose futures depend on being well educated and having worthwhile qualifications. They're competing with the kids in China and South Korea and so forth. And they're also competing, by the way, with the likes of Vietnam, and we're a long way behind Vietnam, which is a poor country. And as far as Europe goes, I haven't got to go that far to Estonia. Estonia is a great system and much more traditional. Way ahead of us. Yeah. So it's a bit miserable, isn't it? Really, but we fight on.
Yeah. When the last PISA results came out and they showed decline again, the head of the General Teaching Council for Scotland wrote an article about it, and he said the problem with these tests is they don't really capture what Scottish education is all about. They say, we're more about values and character education and personality and confidence, and these tests just don't measure these things. That's why we should pull out, because they don't really fit the bill. And I think that's genuinely what people think. They think these numeracy literacy tests, they don't really capture what education's all about. That's a bit old-fashioned. They've moved on from that.
Yeah, and I saw your brilliant spoof of the interview with the teacher when you phoned him up to ask him how your son was getting. That was great, and it you actually did it very well, because it is like that indeed. Teachers look. I am a teacher, and I work with teachers. I also sat on the TUC. I'm not sort of anything other than an ordinary bloke with a family, and life just goes on. But I'm really concerned that these days education is dominated by promoting political correctness, we would say, I suppose, woke ideas, getting people to think correctly. In looking at the curriculum for excellence, it starts off, I was looking at the history one, the social studies they call it, looking at that. You kindly sent it to me, but I was looking at that, and there are 10 learning goals there, quite lengthy ones. And there's one word missing from that whole 10 lines, and that's the word knowledge. Now, Scottish education, it's about knowledge. Education has to include knowledge. You can't just say it's about understanding other people's point of view, which it is. You can't say it's just about recognizing, that there is a social variety and there's diversity and there's need for racial equality. All those things are important. But number one importance is knowledge. You have to have some knowledge. And that's gone. That's not even in the goal. It is there. It's sort of there in the curriculum, but the curriculum, the Scottish curriculum, the curriculum for excellence is a bit like sort of what I say, Sex Pistols history. Anything go, do what you like. It's anarchy UK. And I'm afraid, the trouble is, of course, you can't buck reality forever. And one of these days, and not too far in the future, a lot of young people are going to say, why did you let us down? Mom, Dad, why didn't you complain? Why didn't you do something? Why didn't you say something? I can't read, I can't write, I can't get a job. And I'm miles behind the kids from Singapore.
Yeah, absolutely. This knowledge skills distinction. I remember when I was teaching, you'd hear people say, education's not about filling up empty vessels. that was what they thought in Victorian times or whatever. We've obviously moved on from that. It's nothing to do with that. It's to do with, say, skills, experiences. And in Scotland, it's like there's no balancing perspective to that. It's just ever further in the same direction. I think in Scotland, the SQA, the exam board, rescued the situation to some extent by producing syllabuses that actually do require knowledge. But as you were saying, the curriculum for excellence, I mean, it's bizarre reading it. It's all, sit and have a discussion with some people about something, make a poster or whatever. There's just no content to it at all. How does that compare with the situation in England? Have they toughened up a bit in England?
It's slightly better, but I mean, the thing is, it's remarkable because the Scottish education system has traditionally, I think, been admired throughout the world and been better than England's. Now, in England, and I've obviously been very heavily involved in England, there's been a willingness to recognise that there is a problem. And that's a good sign. I mean, Michael Gove, who was really quite unpopular as an education secretary, but he got it right in terms of he was saying, look, we've diluted knowledge in the curriculum. It's knowledge light now. And ultimately, yes, of course there are other skills involved. But take my subject, history, which is obviously a very important subject in Scotland, in England, because it defines your identity and so forth. Well, in history, what makes history different from any other subject is that it's about knowledge. It's knowledge of the past. Everything else, all the skills, empathy, chronology, understanding points of view, you can teach using fiction. If they're not unique to history, you can get Tolkien's The Hobbit. And I did some research, published it in The Guardian, actually, about 30 years ago, a long time ago, in which I showed that if you use fiction to teach history, it was more effective than teaching real history, because you can manipulate the evidence more readily. And what I noticed, even looking at the exam papers for the Scottish higher today, is that, in the history exams, there are gobbets of evidence. They have Mussolini, for example, in 1920, and it gives a speech by Mussolini. But he didn't make that speech. That's just been invented by the examiner because it fits them. I like the examiner to tell. I actually know Italy very well, speak Italian. I've looked this in. First of all, he didn't make speeches. He did speak once in English to the Americans, but he didn't basically make speeches in English. So they should say that. They should say, we've concocted this, or we've put this together. But they don't say anything. They'll say, this is from Mussolini. This is what he said in 1920. Well, he didn't say this in 1920, so they're faking it. It's a fake exam. It's no longer a history exam. It doesn't matter, though. In England, we have textbooks written by government advisors around the table. I sat with these people around the table, and they are widely used. And they say, we have tried to imagine what these people would say if they came back from the dead. They then quote these people, like whether it's Cecil Rose to damn him, or whether it's somebody who was affected by the British Empire in an adverse way. They just make it up. Well, this is nonsense. This is destructive of the subject, because it's no good saying that we want integrity in the examination system or in the curriculum if you're going to pretend this is actually evidence. It's not evidence. The whole point about history, for example, is that it should be based on the truth. I say the truth. I'm based on evidence. In that sense, you should seek the truth. You don't concoct it. I'm just giving one example. That's history. Yeah. But that the system.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It's a sort of a cancer in the system, really. You've got to break the rottenness of it all and defeat this. But it's going to be an enormous battle. In the end, I think in Scotland we're going to see the reality of the descent into ignorance. It's going to appall people, and there's going to be a demand for higher standards. And it's no good, Mr. Swinney and others coming on saying, like, it's all fine. These kids are getting these social skills. Go to Singapore. The BBC went to Singapore. BBC Wales actually went to South Korea a couple of years ago. The editor of the Sunday Times education section, who I know quite well, she went with them, and they actually gave the South Korean children an English GCSE exam. It's the same as the Scottish one, effectively. For 50, they gave it to their 15-year-old. They did it in 20 minutes. It was an exam which was supposed to take an hour, and they giggled politely and said, "Well, we did that in primary school." I said to Sean, who was the editor of this TV program, I said, were you surprised that these children in South Korea could do this exam so quickly and getting it all right? And she said she was genuinely surprised. I said, look, you are the editor of an education section, and you shouldn't be surprised. This is the way it is. We want to get some children from Glasgow to go off to Singapore or to go off to Seoul and do some and see how they get on. And actually, what Sean found in this TV program was that not only were these children in South Korea better at maths, they were also better at English, which is astonishing.
Yeah, I remember when I was teaching, I had a Japanese boy, and I was teaching him A-level maths, and we started a new topic. He said, "Oh, sir, I'm really struggling with this. It's so long ago. I did it in Japan. I've completely forgotten it." And that's the same as those boys from China.
And it's incredible.
They'd be streets ahead.
It's and people. I mean, within Europe, Estonia, they've adopted some of those Eastern models. I mean, I'm not obsessive about. I know there are downsides to the pressures on children in South Korea, in Japan, and in China. There are downsides. We know that, but it is severe. But there's much to learn, and we have to be able to learn. It's interesting because there was the OECD, this international organization, again did some research quite recently, and what they found was that the bottom 20% in Shanghai, in terms of mathematics, outperform our top 10%. So all the posh kids going to the poshest schools in Scotland or in England, they don't do as well as the children of street cleaners in Shanghai. That's where we are. So if you may have a lot of money, you may think you're buying the best, but actually there are real issues here about mathematical competence. Now, there may be all sorts of reasons for that, but one of the reasons, of course, is that they use a different method of teaching. They use a whole class method, a didactic method. We say, oh, that's didactic. Teacher at the front is Victorian, it is old-fashioned. But the thing is, it works. Children want to learn, so they're much happier when they're making progress. And it's much cheaper as well, because you don't need lots of classroom assistants supporting the teacher, supporting the kids. What you get in Scottish schools and English schools, in the primary school in particular, is you get tables, you get children sat around with their backs to the teacher a lot of the time, and you get classroom assistants, some of whom are very good, and you need some, but you don't need so many. They're supporting a system which involves the teacher managing the learning process, as they say. But what we want is the teacher at the front, and if it was Shanghai, it'd be 40 children. In Scotland, it can be 25 or 30. Teaching those children face to face, not teach them in little groups. It's useless. It doesn't work, and we're finding that out. And Scotland's a bit behind England on this, because at least for all Michael Gove's problems, at least he understood that. Not that he's done anything about it. We're in a big mess down here too. But he recognised there was a problem. And until we face up to the problem, there is no hope. And I don't want to sound like moaning all the time, because we've got great kids, we've got some great teachers in our systems, but we've got to wake up to the fact that the rest of the world is beginning to move on.
Well, the rot's just so deep. In Scotland, the degree of groupthink is frightening. Just going back to England, when Michael Gove toughened up the exams, I was teaching GCSE maths at the time, and the new GCSE maths, it's pretty tough. There's a lot on the syllabus. The exams are really difficult. The only slight catch is you only need 17% to pass it.
Well, if you'd read the front page of the Times, you would have seen what I quoted as saying, and it was correct. It was 15%. Well, this year, the latest ones down here was 18%. So you're not far off. And actually, the point is absolutely right. You make the exam tougher, but then lower the pass mark. And it should be you should get a certificate of incompetence. If you get 15% or 18%, and it gives you a grade C or 4 pass, you should be given a certificate of incompetence. It's proof that you can't do mathematics, not a competence certificate. So you then become a doctor or an engineer, and you're operating on people in Glasgow Central Hospital. You're a nurse, and you can't work out whether the calculator's got it right or not. I'm a nurse. I read Nursing Times from occasionally, and nurses have killed patients because they press the wrong button on the calculator. They can't work out that they've got the wrong answer, and they kill the patient. This is serious. This is really, we can't have professional people who aren't adequately trained. And now we've got COVID and all of this. Well, we can pretend next year maybe Scotland will get rid of it, do without exams or dilute them. But at the end of the day, we've got to stop pretending. These aren't exams. In England, we've had chaos, as you have in Scotland. We need to stop. We have teacher estimates, fine. Call them teacher estimates, and then we know what they are. They are not hires. They are teacher estimates. They are not A-levels. They're teacher estimates, and the employers can work it out from there. But just and kids are happy with that. They want to be honest. Be honest. We tell children. Be honest, and yet we pretend that we've given them hires and so forth, an advanced hires this year when they haven't had. They've had a reduced syllabus, or they've had an estimate. The trend's just emerging in Scotland. Obviously, they cancelled the exams this year. They're now talking about do they need to cancel them next year. Yeah.
But there's a body of opinion, quite substantial and influential in Scotland, that actually they want to do away with exams completely. Because they're forever saying they want to close the attainment gap. And they've said the attainment gap's closed significantly with the teacher just making up the grades. So there's a substantial number of people saying, oh, you know, all exams do is it's just a memory test. It's just a test of how good you are at doing exams. So we can close the attainment gap by not having exams at all. And that's the way the influences are moving in the education system. But the SNP, they don't really show any leadership in education. They just follow the direction of the sort of academic educational establishment. So I think in Scotland, we're all going to move in the direction of doing away with exams completely. I don't know how long it'll take, but that's the direction of travel.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've taught, so you know what this is about. The politicians, on the whole, they don't know anything about education. They haven't got a clue, and it's quite difficult for parents to understand this. You're dealing with politicians who don't understand education, and to some extent, there are too many teachers who are protecting their own position, and it makes it easier, of course, if you mark your own paper, just of continuous coursework. But the rest of the world isn't doing this, or most of the rest of the world. To be fair, France has gone through a similar problem this summer. They've inflated their grades even more, but most of the rest of the world isn't. Our young people they might have certificates at the end given to them by the teacher, but they're not going to be able to reach the level which is being reached by many of our competitor nations. I mean, to some extent, the United States is in the same problem, but even within Europe, we have real issues about standards. And of course, we're obsessed by academic standards. I think I noticed in the Scottish Family Party documentation, you talk a little bit about having more vocational work and training in school. Well, yes, we need that. Like most of the rest of the world, you go Switzerland, Germany, Japan, South Korea, China. They have vocational streams from about the age of 13 or 14. Actually, in Switzerland, at the age of 11. And we need to have horses for courses. It's not sheep and goats. It's horses for courses. And I remember George Galloway, I had an interview with him on the radio once, and he was saying to me, you're talking about sheep and goats, but I'm not. It's horses for courses. Some children are more academic. They need to go to university. They need to do advanced hires and all the rest of it. Others need vocational training. We need plumbers. We need electricians. We need bricklayers. We need beauticians. We need hairdressers. We need people who can do jobs. And not just people like me, historians, And
the thing with the Scottish government, they're so obsessed with equality, as they want everyone to be doing the same all the way through. Because as I say, like you're saying, if it goes into different streams, I think that's somehow not equality. So that must be something wrong. And we just chip something in. I forgot to say earlier on. There will be the opportunity for some of you to pop up to say something later on. What we'd like in particular is if you've got an experience of teaching in Scotland, or an experience your kids have had in Scotland, if you're in school very recently. So if you've got an experience to share with us that's relevant to what we're talking about, we'd love to hear from you later on. I'll put the link in the comments in a while. I'll give it 20 minutes or so. So if you've got something to say, you could chip in with that later. Chris, one of the things I found really helpful on the Campaign for Real Education website is the traditional progressive schools of thought in education. You might have seen that came over into our policies a little bit as well. How would you summarize that distinction, traditional and progressive approaches?
Well, I really come back in terms of what the children's experience is, would be to say that in a traditional classroom, which is what we had perhaps in the 1950s and before, what you have in the best education system today is that you have the teacher in control. You have what I call didactic teaching. You have the teacher at the front of the class, the children sitting facing the teacher. It sounds so basic and so obvious. The teachers should teach the children. The children therefore need to be looking at the teacher, and you have an emphasis on knowledge. And yes, I mean, a good teacher can make this exciting, and it's not all about not about rote learning or just dictating notes. That's rubbish. You get great teachers. William Shakespeare became a very creative writer, but he went to an old-fashioned grammar school where he was actually drilled into rote learning. But you can have better than that. I mean, they didn't do Shakespeare any harm, but we can have a situation where you have the teacher in charge, a teacher with subject mastery. The teacher needs to know the subject. The easy part of teaching today is to do the social work, not the teaching. So we need well-qualified teachers who know their subjects, teaching the class as a whole. And we need rigor. We need to have these children being stretched, but according to their ability. But, interestingly enough, you go to Singapore, they still do what's we were fighting for 30 years ago, which was the GCE O level. They do the exam which is banned in England, but we make it in England. The Cambridge board actually export it to Singapore, and then so we ban it here, export it to our international competitors, and then they use it as their exam, and it's very, very successful. So we have to be aware we can learn not only from our grandparents but also from people around the world. We can learn from other countries. Now, the alternative to that, the progressive approach, it tends to be it's child-centered. Everything starts from the child. So you don't have to tell the child anything. They have to explore. This is back to a very famous French philosopher called Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that the child essentially doesn't need any discipline. They just need to explore and find things out for themselves, and they will do this. Now, I wouldn't want to force my views onto parents, but I think if the state are providing an education, they've got to make sure the children make progress. And if you have children just simply exploring, sitting around in groups, exploring too much, you're going to have indiscipline and you're going to have little progress. They don't need to re-explore. No, they don't need to reinvent the wheel. They do. I mean, I'll give you a very simple example. They need to learn to take times tables. And when I was teaching in the private sector, my children know it by the age of 7. In Scotland, they might not know it by the age of 11. When you're teaching them to read, you've got to teach them phonics. You've got to teach them the sounds of the letters and the blends of the letters. That's blindingly obvious, but until quite recently, that was out of fashion, and we were going on about real books. So we said the teachers were told to think that children were bored by learning the sounds of the letters, and therefore they should recognize the shape of the word. So you can get a 5-year-old and you can show them the word hippopotamus and they will read it and they will recognize it. Then you say his, has, hers. No, can't read that because I don't recognize that word. And that's why there has been a big decline. There was a big decline in literacy in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. It's beginning to go back now to the phonics. Now, of course, it's common sense, but the phonics is Victorian, but it was also taught in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. It's always been taught. It's just blindingly obvious. So use common sense. So the trendy approach, if you like, is very child-centered, very self-indulgent, and there's no control, very little control in the classroom. You let children explore. It's a recipe for anarchy. Read Lord of the Flies when it really goes. If you want to get really depressed.
Yeah, we touched on discipline a little bit there. I mean, the situation in Scotland is education in Scotland are basically pushing restorative approaches. So it's mini counselling sessions. And they don't quite put it down in black and white in policy, but the whole push is the punishment's bad, counterproductive, unnecessary. And the kids are sort of explicitly taught that, punishment doesn't really work. We just need to talk things through, and that works everything out. And the results are disastrous. I mean, what's your take on discipline in schools? Have you come across the restorative approaches?
I've come across it, and actually, I get Scottish journalists asking me, someone speak, please question this approach. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Punishment can be bad if it's unfairly administered, but bullying can be bad. For example, that actually, if you're a victim of bullying, for example, it's very common in school. That's also quite painful for a child. Most children, if you ask children, are actually surprisingly conservative in their views. And in fact, if you talk to 5 or 6-year-olds, they will be 100% more right-wing conservative than anybody you ever spoken to, because they want to be protected. They want protection, and they want the teachers to be in control. I remember an education minister some years ago saying to me, he was a former head teacher himself. He said to me, Chris, in any school, someone's going to be in charge, and it helps if it's the teacher or the head teacher. It does help, but if it's not the head teacher or the teachers, the kids will be in charge. And we have to protect children. Ask the children what they want. They don't want all this restorative justice. But obviously, I'm not trying to say we should be caning the children. What I'm saying, you need a firm line. And certainly in my school, when I was a head teacher, the children, it was a very liberal school, by the way. It was high standard. We taught Arabic, we taught all kids had to do 3 foreign languages. We did Greek, we did Spanish, we did a lot. And we were the first school in Britain to teach Mandarin to 5-year-olds. In some respects, it's quite trendy. It was also a lot of music, and a lot of music, including rock music. So we were not stuck in the mud, but they knew the line. There was a line you didn't cross. If you crossed the line, you were going to be in big trouble. So, when the inspectors came in, they said this was a fantastic school because they didn't see discipline problems. What they saw was a good family atmosphere. They talked about the family atmosphere, but they said the discipline was outstanding. But I didn't need to do it. They all knew. They knew that if they stepped out of line, I would go in heavy. And they knew that. And therefore, there was no problem. I was in charge. And it was incredibly popular. Okay, there weren't that many Catholic schools in London, but it was an incredibly popular school. But the kids enjoyed it. They used to rush into school in the morning, break the door down to get in. The parents used to get incredibly upset if their child couldn't get into the school. There was protests to the guard and all this sort of stuff, So it was a successful school, and it was a relaxed school. But discipline is fundamental. Without the discipline, there's no learning, and there's no happiness, and there's no safety. So does that sound old-fashioned? But it doesn't sound old-fashioned to 5-year-olds who are being bullied, believe me.
It just sounds mainstream. I phoned up a phone-in on Radio Scotland a few months ago. They were talking about this sort of thing. And I said, you need a balance. Talking things through is all well and good, but sometimes kids need punishment. And the two experts they got on, they both responded like in horror, saying they were shocked anyone still holds these views in the 21st century. I think it's just normal. I mean, that's the way virtually all parents bring their kids up. But just go back to what you're saying about like 5- and 6-year-olds being like pretty tough in terms of discipline. They're always talking about listening to children in Scotland. And the General Teaching Council of Scotland did a survey of primary school kids. And they found a lot of them were saying, look, that when someone does something wrong, they should be punished. And the kids were saying, we get pretty annoyed when nothing happens. We want to see some punishment. And normally it's all, we listen to kids, kids are the fount of all wisdom. But as soon as they said that, the person writing the article was saying, oh, well, their minds aren't fully developed. They just don't understand properly yet. But we listen to them on everything else, but they haven't quite got that bit. I mean, the schools in Scotland with police officers stationed in them full time, the schools that have had to call in the police to maintain discipline. There's teachers leaving the profession at a huge rate. Horror stories left, right, and centre. Yet the government's abolishing punishments, basically. And it's not a controversy. It's not brought up in the parliament. It's not discussed in the media. It makes you wonder, how crazy do they have to get before these things are actually talked about and recognised?
It's incredible. I mean, some years ago, I worked with the West Indian community, mainly in Lewisham in London. And my goodness, they were so desperate about the problems of discipline. They were sending their children back to the West Indies because they just couldn't face it anymore. And I've seen that, more generally. That I work with children in deprived parts of the southeast of England, and we've got children there whose parents may be on drugs, may be unemployed, they can't read and write, they're fighting at the school gate. And the school is everything for the children, and they need an order in the school. They crave order, and it's cruel for these adults to inflict their own issues onto children. When they say the children, they're only their brains aren't developed. No, that's because they're children, sir. That's because they are children, and you need to recognise that they're children. They're not adult, and so often it's adult anxieties we inflict on children. We say, effectively, you can't be a child because we adults, we got all sorts of anxieties, and therefore you've got to carry the burden of our anxiety. Children are remarkably simple in terms of they know what's right and wrong, they know what safety means, and they do tend often to see things in black and white terms. I mean, there are complications sometimes, but most children want, above everything else, they want clarity, and they want safety, and they want to see the baddies punished, and that's human nature too. And a lot of people in Scotland and in England want the same. But they're afraid to speak up. They feel they're going to get shouted down. They're told they are they're not PC and all the rest of it. And this whole row about LBGT issues in schools. Now, I'm someone who I can honestly say I've always throughout my life and throughout my teaching career said to my children and to everybody else, you must treat other people as you wish to be treated. So the LGBT issue, in a sense, isn't an issue for me, but I get concerned when I see young children being bombarded with information about some information about LGBT matters, and there's no balance to that. There's no fairness, because what they don't get is the idea or the truth, which is that in the world there are many countries and many governments and many people who are intolerant of an LGBT community, which I regret immensely. For example, if Scotland qualify, I hope they do, for the World Cup in Qatar, and they go to the World Cup, and if they are found guilty of homosexual activity, they can be executed. Now, that attitude to the gay community is, in my view, appalling, but it's still out there. And most of Africa has a very intolerant attitude, for example, to the LGBT community. So in the real world, there's a lot of intolerance. Now, what do we say? Oh, those African, and I did this on Scottish BBC, and I got shouted down by the presenter because I told her, and I told her clear. You know, yes, Africans may be different, they've got a different view, but it doesn't mean say they're inferior, or they are different. So do we say, oh, Africans are uncivilized because they don't hold our views and they don't hold the Scottish view on the LGBT issue? So if you're teaching children about the LGBT matters, you need to tell them the truth. And the truth is half the world doesn't agree with it. And also, as a Catholic, I could say, you know, in the Catholic Catechism, it says that if you are committed, if you are involved in LGBT activities, if you're homosexual activity, you go to hell. Now, it's not, I don't hold that view. I deplore it. But that is still part of the Catholic Catechism. Children need to understand that other people around the world have a different point of view, but they don't teach that. They will not teach that. They don't teach a balance. They just teach one side. Now, we do need to teach the good side, if you like, of people getting on with each other, treating each other properly. But they need to understand that not everybody holds that view around the world. Billions don't, and they're not inferior and bad because they hold these views. And that schools can't approach that. They will not approach it. They will not accept diversity in that sense, which is wrong. So that's why I say leave it alone. By all means, touch on it, but don't go into too much detail. Because if you go into too much detail, explain why you can't go to Qatar. That's the truth.
But the situation in Scotland, it's as though they've said to the Green Party, would you like to write our curriculum on all of these contemporary issues? I mean, there's the LGBT, there's all the, you know, the BLM, feminist, climate change, sort of equity, equality thing, whatever view you take on those things. The fact is in Scotland that it's just, I mean, it's pure indoctrination. They get one side of the story from nursery onwards with no balance at all. For a teacher to even suggest to offer an alternative view, I mean, they'd be taking their career in their hands, and you know, it could be all over for them. So they just hear this uniform message. The possible silver lining to the cloud is the kids are naturally rebellious. Whatever they have stuffed down their throats for whatever 15 years at school, by the time they've finished, maybe a lot of them are going to be saying, look, I've had enough of this. I'm going to think for myself a little bit. But the number of parents I hear from who are now saying they're going to homeschool their kids because they don't trust, even sending them to nursery, they don't trust the state to refrain from just presenting all sorts of messages that they disagree with. And again, it's just so out of hand that there's no balancing voice in the Scottish educational establishment or in the Parliament or anywhere. So it's just it's a one-way street. It's a massive problem. Just something else we touched on earlier on. Be interested to hear your take on therapeutic education. I think is in overdrive in Scotland. All the time that used to be learning the facts is now, you know, how you're feeling, how's your well-being, are you feeling, you know, nurtured and, you know, responsible or included or whatever. What's your take on that? Is that a recent phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, it's comparatively recent. Education as therapy is now the dominant prevailing philosophy in British schools anyway, and it's to some extent in American schools. You've got to make children who go into these lessons on personal, social, health education, they go in without any problems, but they have a lesson and then they come out and they feel we've got a lot of problems. So my concerns about therapy, education as therapy, is that children who were perfectly happy suddenly find actually they don't feel so happy anymore, because what the teacher is doing is probing to say, look, you know, are you really happy? You can't really be happy. Are you really know who you are, for example? Can you actually identify yourself? What are you? What are you about? That's actually in the curriculum. So it's a recipe for unhappiness. It's total introspection, and it's an industry. But of course, it's easy for the teacher to be a pseudo-psychologist. Far easier to teach that than to teach physics. You know, we can't. I mean, in England, there's almost over a third of teachers leave within 5 years because they can't hack it, because they can't hack the problem to discipline. With the coronavirus situation, we're going to have a boom, I think, probably in teacher training, because there's no other jobs, so people are going to go into teaching. But we'll see quite a few getting out. I mean, I suppose, the idea of teaching as therapy, look, it's they should all the idea of socialization should pervade everything in the school. Of course you should correct children's behavior and so forth. You don't need particular lessons on therapy or on introspection. No, there should be an atmosphere in the school. It could be a religious atmosphere, but it doesn't have to be, whereby everything you do is actually part of a philosophy of life. And that, on the whole, what gives people happiness is helping other people. And that's my experience. And it's not wanting what you have in life, it's having what you want. And children need to get that. It's a Buddhist thing. That's what it's all about. So therapy, no, I'm not a fan of therapy. I think it's an industry, and I think it's an excuse for not teaching. And it's an easy thing to do. And we've got to try and get away from it. But you're right, Richard, because I think kids, young people, I shouldn't call them kids. Some people say you shouldn't call them kids. Look, young people, they rebel against all this sort of stuff. And I guess, go 20 years along the line, you're going to find a lot of people be rebel. The danger is you get people's backs up so much that they end up you're going in the opposite direction. This is what children do anyway, and we need someone in the educational world, possibly a minister, but certainly a union leader, to say there is a possibility that we may be wrong. There's just a possibility we may have got it wrong. There's just a possibility. And look at these science and maths results to prove it. There may be a possibility. Open up that. But at the moment in Scotland, more than in England even, England's pretty chronic. There's no recognition that there cannot be any other way other than the therapeutic way. School is about therapy. And in South Korea, well, they're the ones that probably could do with the therapy. But, there's a few issues there. We know that about children's happiness. But when we look at surveys, we find that our British children actually come at the bottom of the league table for happiness as well. So all this therapy, all it's doing is making them more miserable. So, so we have, it sounds bad to go on moaning and all the time, we do this, but we have to speak up. I mean, thank goodness the Scottish Family Party exists, because at least you're there. And you're there, you can express some of these views. You're giving me a forum now. You need to have people who will stand up. For goodness sake, Scotland has stood up for centuries and fought against the English, for example. Well, stand on your feet, Scots, and fight back against this rubbish you're getting in schools. That's what you need to do. Think of Robert the Bruce, do it again and again, and keep trying, because in the end, we can beat it.
I mean, it's really what you say. So obviously academic standards declining, but they claim this is because they're really focusing on well-being and mental health. But that's also declining. But no matter how bad it gets, the prescription's always the same. The only prescription is we need to go further in the direction we're going. If we can just go a bit further, maybe that's when it'll all turn around and start picking up. Something else I would just be interested to hear your thoughts on. Harm reduction. Sex education, drugs, alcohol, whatever. The harm reduction approach.
Well,
what's your take on that?
Yeah, what's my take on that? Well, first of all, parents have to be in charge of that. I mean, you have to consult parents. And parents certainly should have the right to withdraw. The trouble is, teachers aren't psychiatrists, nor are they experts in these areas. Most teachers, certainly in my experience, they don't want to be doing that. They don't know. They're not psychiatrists. They're not drugs experts. They're not up to the job. They can't do it. Maybe they can teach some geography or some history or some maths, but they can't do the psychiatry side of things. So first of all, they can't do it, and it stresses them out. Therefore, what happens? It attracts a certain sort of person in who they can do it. It causes more damage than anything else. It pulls people in who are going to give you all the answers. There aren't any answers. I mean, the answers are basic parental common sense, and yes, by all means, tell children there's a problem and explain to them the dangers of drugs, but you don't want to be doing this too early. 4, 5, 6-year-olds don't need too much of this. Maybe it's, when they get a little bit older, they are going to see these problems on the streets. They're going to walk around Edinburgh and they're going to see people lying in the street, which is terrible. And we need to understand children need to be humane. They need to understand the need to have empathy for other people. But once you go along the pathway of focusing over much on the dismal side of life and on the drugs and on the sex and all the rest of it, it can cause a huge amount of damage to children's sense of well-being. It actually damages them rather than helps them. Now, what I'm saying, of course, is totally contrary to what's being told by many in the schools. But what I've said all along is that just imagine that what I'm saying is correct. Just imagine what mom and dads mostly say. Look, we want to look after our kids. We don't want too much of this stuff. We're a bit afraid. And you're right. They're taking them out of school. Quite a few parents now, home education. We strongly support home education. There are downsides to it, socialization, but But, you know, if your child is having a rough time at school, maybe being bullied, maybe being indoctrinated, you fully understand. I spoke to a conference in London not so long ago about this, about homeschooling, and there were quite a lot of Muslims in the audience, and they were particularly supportive. And I was aware that one of the objections to homeschooling is that it can be, you know, it can be associated with radicalization. But it's such a minority where that's the case. And, you know, I remember putting out something in the national newspapers a few years ago in the wake of the Paris bombings, when those horrible things happened in those terrorist attacks. And I published some material which was on the Times Education Supplement website. It was a model lesson. And it asked children to imagine the point of view of the terrorists in Paris and to look at the good points about being a member of ISIS. For example, that you have all these female slaves. And it directed the children to the ISIS website. Now, this hit the headline. It caused a big storm. And, you know, MPs got in touch and so forth with me. They couldn't believe this was going on. I said, look, you want to get real. When you're talking about homeschooling being a danger of radicalization, it's the state schools which are radicalizing kids. And that's an example. And by the way, on the history front, you know, we're talking about what should we teach in history is a big, you know, one of the big things now about landmarks and statues coming down, all this sort of stuff. And people get very concerned, you know, should we teach Lord Nelson? Look, in England and in Scotland, the national curriculum doesn't require you to teach anything very much. You can do what you like. And, you know, we did a survey only about 18 months ago. We looked at the 19th century, wanted to work out what were children in England and Scotland, what were teachers choosing to teach to their children? What were the popular topics? So we did a survey of the model lessons on the Times Education Supplement. So for the 19th century, yes, Queen Victoria was a popular lesson plan. But the second Queen Victoria wasn't Gladstone, it wasn't Nelson, it wasn't Wellington, it was Jack the Ripper. That's what they were doing, Jack the Ripper. And the forensic details of Jack the Ripper, because it lends itself to detective work, they would say. So we're living in a fantasy world here. You know, I did Channel 4 program about race and stuff a year ago, and statues. I was interviewed by Afua Hirsch. I told her this. I said, don't you get worried about the Nelson, because she was saying Nelson should come down, or people were saying Nelson should come down for his column and so on. These statues it's a big thing in Scotland too. I mean, look, why are you concerned about it? The kids aren't learning. They don't know who Nelson is. They don't know who he is. They tell you about Jack the Ripper. And she said to me afterwards, I didn't see that one coming, she said. But, you know, look, it's there are so many of these difficulties in schools, and I think in the end there will be a reaction. We've carried on the good fight for 30 years, and I get to the stage now where I'm not quite a lone voice. We have supporters, of course, but you know, the Campaign for Education is quoted quite a lot in the press and internationally, because we feel, you know, it's worth fighting for. We mustn't throw in the towel. So I say, thank goodness Scottish Family Party is there. And let's have another one. Let's have an English family party.
Yeah, my experience when I was teaching, I mean, I would often sit there in training sessions, be thinking, you know, I don't think this is quite right. There's another point of view here. Yeah. And often in courses, the speaker, so bring some speaker in, they'd be presenting the thing. At some point, I put my hand up and say, yeah, you know, I don't quite see it that way. I think maybe there's a case to see it this way. There'd be this sort of uncomfortable silence in the room. Everyone would put their heads down. Yeah. And the person taking the session would just say, oh, well, some people might think that, and then just ignore it and carry on. And it'd be really quite uncomfortable. But then you get to break time, get your cup of tea or whatever, then go to the gents. And people said, oh, I'm so glad you said that. Oh, that's what I think as well. There's a lot of nonsense in that. I don't know what he's on about. That'll never work. You tell him. Then you go into the second half. I might just, you know, question something in the second half. But everyone will be sitting there again, heads down in their notes, and they'll understand it. So I think you get alternative views expressed in the, you know, the sort of corner of the staff common room. But as soon as it becomes any sort of official meeting, but probably in Scotland, the school leaders are in a difficult position, because if Education Scotland says, right, you should be abolishing punishments, and you say to the school leadership, I think that's a crazy idea. These are the reasons why it's not going to work. Then, I mean, what can the school leadership do? They can't go to Education Scotland and say, oh, by the way, we'd like you to change the government's policy because we don't think it'll work. They've got to go along with it. So if you're someone disagreeing with it, they're just frightened. Oh, I hope the inspectors don't find out. We need to be telling the inspectors all our staff are really enthusiastic about this. And so even where teachers do put forward a different view, it's really hard for it to go anywhere because it's so controlled from the top down.
Yeah,
I'll see if I can put our invitation in the comments here. I'm not sure this is going to work, but let's have a look. Right, so if you've got a story to tell of if you're a teacher in Scotland, or if you're in school recently, or something from your kids that's relevant, then I say follow the link and we'll see if we can bring you on. Right, just while we're seeing if anyone pitches up, I'd just like to run another idea that we've got in our seems we're going a bit glitchy, that we've got in our policies, and that's to have logic lessons, sort of critical thinking lessons. But what we think is these shouldn't be related to current affairs, because as soon as they're related to current affairs, the doors open for basically the teacher's own views. Teachers generally are a sort of left progressive mindset. So the doors open for all sorts of political or philosophical biases. So we don't want that. We just want to teach critical thinking, clear, logical thinking. And we think that's something that justifies a spot on the curriculum. What do you think of that idea? Have you ever seen anything similar to that at school level?
Well, they should be applying critical thinking to everything, really. I mean, when they're teaching, when you're teaching history, geography, or RE, English, there's an element of critical thinking. In my view, and critical thinking is quite an in vogue thing at the moment. And of course, we're in favour of critical thinking. Of course, we are. It's very, very important. But the critical thinking has to go wider than just the narrow band it lives in at the moment. When I talk to you about LGBT issues, and I've talked about it in a sympathetic way, but I'm saying if you teach it to children, you need to understand the point of view of the, so as I mentioned Qatar as an example, because the World Cup's there, but there are people around the world who have a different view. That's called critical thinking as well. So I'm conscious of the fact that teachers probably, most of them aren't going to do it particularly well. There's a very good reason for teaching critical thinking, but it should pervade everything, particularly history, RE lessons, English lessons, and so forth. So it shouldn't be as separated out, but that sort of thing should be integrated. Generally speaking, it's probably going to be misuse. And just note your point, by the way, about the, you don't raise your voice. I spoke recently at a national conference, a UK conference actually, of university admissions tutors. And I was with the top people, and I spoke, and I said, you understand, a lot of children going to university, a lot of youngsters going to university now. They're working at the coffee bar over the road. They can't get a job. They're underemployed or unemployed. And there was a hushed silence. Fortunately, the hushed silence was witnessed by a national newspaper who phoned me and said, my God, that was incredible. But anyway, after the meeting, 3 different admissions tutors from main universities came to me and said, thank God you said it, because no one else will say it. It's exactly what you said. They won't say it in public. They knew that a lot of children going to university shouldn't be going to university. They should be doing on-the-job training, apprenticeships, and they'd be far happier. So, we're talking about these issues. They won't raise issues. Critical thinking is vital. It should pervade the whole curriculum. We should always be critical of what goes on in the school. You shouldn't be confined to individual lessons. But, I'm not against teaching philosophy in school. I don't see why not. But you've got to have very able teachers to do it. And some of these teachers can't teach children to read and write. And as you know this, because when you go into many Scottish and English schools, the children can't read and write when they leave. 20% leave secondary school and they're unemployable. They walk the green mile to no job, no future, no qualifications, no hope. That's it for them. And we've got to we've got to give those poor kids a chance, and we've got to teach them the basics. And they're not getting that. So that's the main the reason why we need to is critical thinking. We need to be getting the job done. That's the most critical thinking you can have. Teach them English and teach them mathematics.
So we haven't got long left. Just a couple of things. A question come up in the comments, which I thought was a good one. So we'll cover that, and then we'll bring someone in to make a point just quickly at the end. Right. So, how does the Campaign for Real Education get media coverage for its views when we can't? Well, that's a good question.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and we've. I remember the Times Educational Supplement said that a few years ago now that we got the second highest media coverage on education of anybody in Britain. That appalled the government, by the way. But look, it's simply that what we say is actually, we think is valid, and also because no one else is saying it. And also we say it in a very, we're not extreme, we're just ordinary people given a bit of common sense, and we have experience. They come to me, they come to us. Before me, my predecessor, Nick Seaton, they come to us. He did a great job. We actually had ministers chairing our meetings You know, we actually had education ministers chairing a campaign for real education meetings. That's how big we were. We had secretaries of state coming to our fringe meetings. So over the years, we've had a lot of coverage. They've come to us. Therefore, sometimes you have to wait for them to come. But when things go badly wrong, then they start to turn to others for an alternative opinion. So there has to be patience. It's not you're not been going long. You know, we're into this 30 years or so. So it takes time, but you have to give an alternative opinion. You have to continue with it. And in the end, people will listen if you're right. And you are right. Your views reflect a large number of views of Scottish people. And I know that because most Scottish people are sane. They're not taken up by this and they're not brainwashed. And they may keep quiet, but they know the truth. And I just pray that this Scottish Family Party gets some attention. And the one reason, of course, they won't come to you is because they don't want they don't want people to hear your views. I've done quite a few things on Scottish BBC, but I've noticed recently they've not come back to me because I upset them last time. Because I said to the BBC in Scotland, what I've said to you is, look, you know, there are people around the world who've got a very different opinion from our teachers in this country, and those people around the world, they need to be listened to as well, but they don't like that. It challenges them. I spend a lot of time talking on Scottish radio about should there be unisex loos and things, for heaven's sake, you know, and should we have drag queens coming into primary schools. They have me on for this. So, you know, I when I give my views, I do sometimes upset the Scottish BBC, but they're a public broadcasting channel. They should be looking for impartiality. They have a responsibility. But anyway, ultimately, people will rebel. Trust in that, and your time will come. The time, but it takes time. It takes. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to be patient. You have to keep putting out your views as far as you can. Put them out how? Well, you can issue press releases, and when you talk to people, when they ask you, you give them their views. And parents have more power. We've seen it this summer in Scotland, in England. Parents have immense power. There's a lot of parents who are very unhappy. And find yourself a big sponsor. And that'd be
I think part of the that's a bit glitchy. I think part of the problem for the Scottish Family Party is we are a political party. So like the government can't come and ask us for a bit of advice because that's like political suicide. So all the political parties want to ignore us completely. But hope that I would say it's sort of letters pages in newspapers. We can get some common sense published there. That's one outlet. But you say like the BBC going to you to get this perspective, whereas there's the homegrown version here.
Yeah.
But again, I think part of their thinking will be that they don't want to be seen to be promoting a political party. But not just because they don't want us to grow. They don't want our influence to grow. So they would rather a more self-contained campaigning group. But I think education is very much a key area for us. I think we get huge support, and what we say resonates with as you're saying, with a huge number of people. So it's a very powerful campaign issue. Our campaign
is strictly non-party political. We upset everybody. We upset Tories, we upset Labour, we upset Lib Dems, we upset the Greens, we upset everybody. I think the press know that. I mean, the international channels do as well. We do American television. We do a lot of channels around Europe, and so they know we give an honest opinion. And that's all you can ever do. I do take your point. As a political party, your position is different. Somehow, the message has got to be got out to parents. But ultimately, of course, when things go badly wrong, then the Scottish Family Party will be coming in, I think. I mean, they are going badly wrong in education, and honest commentators will say so. Yeah.
Now, I'll just say we had someone ready to appear on screen, but they were having some technical problems. So, Brian, if you're watching, they kept saying you were disconnecting. So sorry you didn't make it on. But our time is almost up. Chris, that was absolutely brilliant. Fantastic. Really appreciated you coming on and sharing your wisdom with us. So we'll have to do it again sometime. That was really great. Thank you for all your comments as well. Say sorry, I don't know what you call it when someone appears on the screen. It's not a phone in. I don't know what the word for it is, but we didn't manage to get someone popping up on the screen. But definitely next week, say Phil Tansel will be here, and a fascinating person to come along and have a chat with. So do join us next week at 7:30. But thanks again to Chris, and a good night to everyone. Good night.